Our next slide, or our next slides are going to be of connective tissue. And connective tissue are kind of interesting because we kind of think of them as connecting things, but sometimes it's hard to imagine how they're truly connecting. Connective tissue has both cells, and we'll see the cells in each example, but they also have a matrix, and a matrix is a substance that's outside the cell. What that is composed of is going to depend on the particular type of connective tissue. But the function of connective tissue is enclosing and separating organs, or connecting tissues like tendons and ligaments would do, or supporting and moving us, as in bones, storing fat, and we know fat is a storage form of energy, and it will also cushion and insulate. And then transportation, like blood. Blood is actually a connective tissue, which seems kind of funny, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So as we look at different types of connective tissue, and remember, I'm following through in your book here, so you should see pictures that look similar, if not identical, to these. So let's look at the left-hand side, and this is loose areolar connective tissue. And it doesn't look very structured, okay? It's got some collagen fibers here, which are the pink. It has little purple nuclei that you can see throughout it. It's also got these funny-looking dark kind of lines, but there doesn't seem to be anything regular about those. Those are elastin, like elastic tissue. And loose areolar connective tissue has the role of holding your organs in place, for example. So let's say you do a cartwheel. When you do a cartwheel, all of your intestines don't come up and hang around your heart. They have an area that they stay in. They don't even move for the most part. And that we can thank our loose areolar connective tissue for. But then we have over on the right-hand side a completely different looking connective tissue. But this connective tissue is dense connective tissue. And the dense connective tissue, it's harder to see the nuclei in it, okay? But there's one right above the pointer, if you can see that. So there's some darker spots, but look how much more compact this looks. It looks a lot stronger, and it actually makes sense that it would look a lot stronger because this is what makes up our ligaments and tendons, and we know that those for the most part are very tough structures. So we have collagen fiber and we have our cells. So the collagen is the extracellular matrix, and then we have our cells in it. And when we're talking about collagen or our connective tissue, the cell that we're talking about is something called a fibroblast. And anytime you hear a site, okay, so like an osteocyte, that is a cell that makes bone. But blasts are similar. So when you see the word blast, that also is a cell. So if we say a fibroblast, that's a particular cell that makes collagen or connective tissue. And next we have cartilage, and this is shown from the trachea. The trachea has cartilage in it. And we're going back to some terms actually that we used when we talked about the osteon, if you have looked at the model of the bone yet. But this is all substance around it, okay? So this is our substance, our extracellular substance, and then we have what's called a lacuna, and a lacuna is just a little opening that holds a cell. And when we're talking about hyaline cartilage, we're talking about a chondrocyte. We're back to the site at the end again, CYTE versus blast. But here's a chondrocyte. And the way I always remember this, and my suggestion to you is you remember it because it will be on the quiz, is they look kind of like eyeballs. Okay, so they're kind of give the impression of eyeballs. That's the only one that looks like this. As we look to the right, this is adipose, and adipose is a little bit different because it doesn't stain. So it almost looks just like there's nothing here, but it's actually adipose tissue or fat. And along the side, the nucleus gets pushed up against the side. You can see in some spots where it looks a little bit darker along the cell membrane. And those are the nucleus that has gotten pushed toward the edge of the cell by the accumulation of fat within it. This is a blood vessel because fat needs to be supplied with blood as well. But frequently what you're going to see when you see a lot of fat in a sample is and if the cell membranes aren't really obvious, it'll almost look like there's nothing there. Now, this is compact bone, and if you've looked at the bone video, we looked at something called the osteon, and this is an osteon, sort of one unit of bone. And when you're looking at this, you'll get a better view of it in the model, but these concentric circles are called lamella, and the lamella is the matrix for the bone. It contains calcium and phosphorus, among other things, but these dark areas around the concentric circles are called lacuna, okay, just like in our hyaline cartilage. They're called lacuna, and just like in hyaline cartilage, they are what is housing the cell, okay, in this case an osteocyte. So this central region that goes down the center of each osteon houses the blood supply, so both artery and vein, as well as nerve. Okay, so when you break a bone, you know it hurts, but you also know that it repairs, and the presence of all the blood supply in each of these osteons helps with that repair process. And to the right here, we are looking at spongy bone. Now, compact bone is found on the outside. If you look at this drawn model up on the top, compact bone is found around the outside. It's also found down what's called the diaphysis, which is this long shaft of the bone. We're looking at the femur, okay? So that is telling me that it's the femur, and we'll get that in a couple labs. So here's our femur, and we know a femur has a long shaft. So the shaft is called the diaphysis, and that's made of compact bone, and it's filled with yellow marrow, which is fat. And then we get to the outer ends, and the outer ends are called the epiphysis, and the epiphysis is made of spongy bone, and spongy bone contains a different type of bone marrow called red marrow, and red bone marrow is where blood cells are made. So although it looks spongy and like you'd be able to mush it, it is still bone tissue, but it's not as strong as our compact bone and not as structured. But down in the bottom, the picture in the bottom, you're seeing the spongy bone, and these are the holes in the spongy bone that you're seeing, and those are blood cells that you're seeing in it as well. So here's bone, and this type of spongy bone looks a little bit to me like hyaline cartilage, doesn't it? It's got a little bit those eyeballs. I will not ask you to identify spongy bone, okay? In my quiz, I will not ask you to identify this type of bone. I just wanted to give you a comparison of spongy versus compact bone. And our last of the connective tissue is blood. And it kind of seems funny to me, it always has, that connective tissue would include blood. Now, I understand that blood is connected all through the body, but what is the matrix that we would associate with this? It's really easy to see the blood cells. Okay, these are blood cells. It's really easy to see the cells, but what we're missing here, what we're not able to see, is the matrix. And the matrix is the plasma. Plasma is the fluid that surrounds the cells. Okay, it's just not something that we see or we really think of that way. But looking at what's here, first of all, these cells that have the paler center, that's called a red blood cell. And a red blood cell, we know, carries oxygen and CO2 to cells and away from cells. So these are oxygen carrying cells. Right here, this smaller, it almost looks just like junk on the cell that I'm going from moving around, those are called platelets. And platelets are a cell that functions in clotting. They're much smaller, you can see that, but having platelets and having them float around in the plasma is important for our clotting mechanism as well. The bigger cells we see here, okay, and these are much larger, these are a type of white blood cell. And these particular white blood cells have an unusual shaped nucleus. And notice that the nucleus in each one is a little bit different. That's all right. These are cells that phagocytize or eat other things that should not be present. So these are white blood cells. But this one up here, that's a white blood cell as well, but we have several different types of white blood cells. So this is called a lymphocyte. And that big purple part is actually the nucleus. You can see just barely at the bottom of this one a little bit of cytoplasm. Over on this other picture here, you can see a little bit more cytoplasm. The light blue is the cytoplasm, where that very dark color is the nucleus. So these are white blood cells, and they're called neutrophils. And this is a white blood cell type that's called a lymphocyte. So neutrophil and a lymphocyte.